Good morning, and welcome to the UCLA Anderson Forecast special webinar on the future of business travel. This webinar will proceed with a conversation followed by some questions from our audience. So if you have questions, please put the questions in the Q&A at the bottom. We will likely not be able to get to all of your questions, but I'll try and look through them and ask those that are most salient to our topic of the day. I'm privileged to have with me today the CEO of United Airlines, Mr. Scott Kirby. Scott is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy and has a master's in operations research from George Washington University. From 2006 to 2013, Scott was president of U.S. Airways. From 2013 to 2016, president of American Airlines. And from 2016 to 2020, president of United Airlines, at which time he was appointed to his current position of Chief Executive Officer, United Airlines and United Airlines Holdings. So it is arguably, maybe not arguably, that Scott knows more about commercial aviation today than anyone else. So Scott, welcome to UCLA.
Thank you, Jerry. Glad to be here.
So we're going to talk about the future of business travel, but I think I'd like to go back to 2019 and into 2020. And you've been in commercial aviation for a long time and been through many cycles, but the typical business cycle is there's sort of more of a gradual downturn as you go into a recession, but we get into the end of February and early March of 2020, and demand just falls off a cliff. How did you and your team think about this and think about how to pivot and what was going to be important?
We've never experienced anything like this. In very short order, our revenues went down by 99%. In a normal recession, it's single-digit percent. And by mid-March, we're burning $100 million of cash per day, which is a remarkable number. But I'm really proud of what we did at United. And we were the first airline, but even the first large company in the country, I think, to recognize the likely severity of COVID. And it really started the last weekend of February of 2020 when COVID showed up, what they called COVID then, the coronavirus showed up in northern Italy. And I got our executive team on the phone that Sunday and said, I don't know why nobody else realizes that this is a global pandemic yet, but it is. And we're going to start preparing. And within a week, we'd raised several $billion of financing. We'd started our planning for the future. And all that put us in a position as we went through the crisis. I told the Wall Street Journal recently that after that Sunday, there was nothing over the night that's happened in the next, almost 2 years now, that really surprised me. There were things that were, on the edges of the fairway, but everything has been in the fairway. And that setup really positioned us to be aggressive, be decisive, take a leadership role, and really set the table for everything that came during the crisis, but also what is going to come after the crisis is over, to really put United in the leading position in global aviation.
So I'd like to explore that a bit because in June, United Airlines placed an order for 270 new airplanes. Yeah. And I mean, admittedly, June, it looked like maybe we were getting to the end of the period of vaccinations and maybe COVID was going to be over with. We didn't have the Delta surge then, but still, that's a strong vote of optimism. And what brought you to conclude that that was the right decision?
So really, I mean, I'll go all the way back to, when we started in last weekend of February. We thought that the crisis was going to be deep. And we thought by the time we got to April, our best guess was that we wouldn't be getting back to normal until Christmas of 2021. And business travel wouldn't really begin returning in earnest until 2022. Sadly, that forecast is turning out to be remarkably prescient in hindsight. But what we also did is we always thought, we had intense conversations around the future. We always thought business demand and international would ultimately come back. And I'm sure we'll talk about why later, but we always thought that. And so our competitors, when you got into April, May, even June of last year and saw the big downturn, went the other direction. People panicked, I think, and said, this is never going to get better. And they retired hundreds of airplanes. Because we felt confident that the ultimate recovery would be robust, we started trying to go the other direction. And we already had 230 deliveries coming, but we decided to, and we went and negotiated. And so now we have a total of 500 airplanes that are going to get delivered in the next 5 years. So 100 per year. By the way, the most I'm aware of any airline in the world ever taking was a little over 60 in a single year. We have 5 years where we'll be 60-something% higher than the highest anyone has ever taken. And really what we did was everyone else was turning left. Everyone else was shrinking and saying the world is going to be different. People are not going to travel anymore. We thought that the right decision was to turn right, but it magnified the impact of our bet because we were the only one turning right. And by, I think we had made the right decision. We had the right bet, but when you're the only one making the bet, it just really magnifies the impact. And that's part of what gives us so much excitement about the future at United.
So those aircraft, those 500 aircraft, does that represent an expansion of capacity or retirement of older airplanes, or what is the mix of that?
It's almost all expansion of aircraft. So we have 500 of those airplanes coming. Our normal course will retire 40 to 50 airplanes, so think mainline airplanes. So think of it as 90% expansion airplanes. We are going to retire 50-seat regional jets, about 200 to 300 of those. So some of them will be replacement for that. But these airplanes are so much bigger. They're 3 to 4 times as large. At least in terms of the number of seats that we're flying around, it's 75% growth airplanes, about 75% growth airplanes.
And in that expansion of capacity, is that weighted towards international or domestic?
Well, these airplanes are mostly domestic for us. But the other thing that's unique is United already had orders coming for international airplanes. And we're really the only big airline in the Western Hemisphere that didn't retire a big portion of our wide body aircraft fleet for international. And so today, we actually now have about as many international wide body airplanes as all of the rest of the US airlines combined. That's why we serve uniquely, there's dozens of destinations around the world, countries, only US airline that flies to India, almost the only airline flies to anywhere in Africa, destinations in Asia that we're the only US airline. Now, many of those aren't flying right now because of the Pacific is slower to recover, but we've really become the flag carrier of the United States. And during the crisis, it was relevant too. We carried 160 million doses of vaccine into the country. And, as the airline that kind of, during the India crisis, we were carrying hundreds of tons of oxygen canisters into India every day and other medical equipment when the Delta variant first kicked up there. And we're in a different position. So while the aircraft order is about domestic, we already had big wide body aircraft orders and we didn't retire any airplanes. So you'll see, actually, we've already said next year we're going to have a 10% growth next year alone compared to 2019 in international. And I'm sure we'll be the only US airline that is larger internationally. And, we're obviously going to be quite a bit larger.
So let's talk about domestic travel. So what we saw this summer was an increase in discretionary or leisure travel by air. That's abated a little bit of late because of the Delta surge, but Americans want to travel, want to go on vacation, want to visit families they haven't seen for a long time. Business travel doesn't seem to have really come back, but you're very optimistic that it's going to be coming back soon. Can you share your thoughts on why you're optimistic?
Sure. So I admit that I'm still in the minority, but 15 months ago, I was a minority of one when I said that I thought business travel would return in its entirety. And there are a lot more people that say that today. The reason has always been that business travel is not about transactions. Zoom is great for a transactional experience or replacing a phone call, it's better, but it is not the same as being there in person and building relationships. And business travel has been about human nature and is about building relationships. I don't fly, I'm not flying to COP26, here in another week to sign some papers and do transactions. I'm going there to meet people, to find other like-minded individuals that want to address climate change. And that's the value. The serendipity of meetings and of conversations when you're in person is dramatically different than when you're on something like Zoom. And I've thought that from the beginning, but the more I do it personally, I'm traveling now more than I ever have, and I realize how powerful it is. But also all the anecdotes, of business travelers who early on thought that they were going to not travel as much. The number of people who've now told me I'm traveling more and I'm going to travel more is large. And business travel hasn't fully recovered yet, but a lot of that is because particularly in big cities, on the coast, San Francisco, New York, but Chicago, LA, a lot of people are not in offices yet. And so until people are back in offices, it's harder. But we've already seen business travel, beginning to come back, getting close to 50% of where it was. All of our corporate accounts tell us there's going to be a big spike in business travel starting in January as people are back in the offices. So I don't think it'll happen overnight. And I think there will be things about it that are different. But because it's about human nature, I am confident that people need to connect with each other, unite with each other, and business travel will return in full.
So two kind of connected questions in that regard. One is, we hear a lot about this new technology, and you mentioned that Zoom doesn't replace, or other platforms like Zoom, it doesn't really replace that in-person experience. But we also hear quite a bit about managers who have a remote site or maybe multiple remote sites who were going every month and now feel that they can maybe go every other month and do a Zoom in the intervening month. And so kind of related to that, in your prediction of when business travel will come back to trend or back to where it was in 2019, when do you see that happening?
So one, I do think there'll be differences. Some things that people used to do for business travel, they won't do. One of the things that we've said a little tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, and it would probably apply to people that are there in the LA Basin area, is there's a new form of business travel of people that are replacing their daily 2-hour commute by car to the office with a once a month 2-hour commute by air, meaning I moved to Reno, Nevada. I still work for a company in Los Angeles, but there's a week a month that I have to be there in the office in person. And so I'm flying back and forth, to be there in person. So I do think business travel will change in some ways, but that it will be at least as much as it was before. As to the timing, I think it's probably the beginning of 2023 before we're back to 100% domestically. My guess is Europe will be on the same trajectory. It still remains to be seen what's going to happen in the Pacific with the reopening. I think the Pacific is probably 12 to 18 months behind Europe and the US on reopening. But, we're 15 to 18 months away, I think, from getting back to normal.
So let's explore the international part again. So Trans-Pacific, which is a big part of United's international business, has been weak at best.
Yeah.
And we see, with the Delta surge, the Southeast Asia closing down, periodic closures in the quarantines and the like. And you just said that you thought that this was going to take longer to resolve and come back to trend. Yeah. But traveling Trans-Pacific, I know this from flying your airline to Asia twice a month for a couple of years. That's a long ways.
It's a long way.
And if you can substitute a virtual trip for any one of those trips, you save yourself 30 hours in the air. So what are your thoughts on that? That yes, it's better to be there in person, but is it that much better?
Yeah.
That it's worth that cost.
So, again, I do think it's the same thing, that there's not a substitute for being there in person. Relationships matter intensely. Early in the crisis, I joked that, there are people, professional services firms. I talked to a number of the CEOs for consulting companies who've said, our business is never going to come back at where it was. This works great. We're going to be down 50%. And I would tell them at the time, like, my guess is the first time you lose a sale to someone who shows up in person is the last time you try to make a sale on Zoom. And now, like, across the board, these same people who told me they were going to be down 50% have said now they're going to travel more. And I like behavioral economics, and I love behavioral economics. And one of the things you learn in that is what people say they're going to do and genuinely think they're going to do is not always the same as what they actually do when the world changes. And my guess is, I don't know why you were traveling twice a month, but that there were good reasons to do it, and that those good reasons will ultimately reassert themselves, and you will find yourself traveling twice a month again if you're doing the same thing as you were before. And I guess we'll see. I admit that I'm still in the minority on that, but I said earlier that I was in the minority of one. If you went back and listened to people's public commentary in March, April of last year, they would have said business demand is going to permanently be down more than 50%. And then it's gradually shifted. And now people say it's going to be down 10 to 15%. We've at least been consistent that we thought it was going to return in its entirety. And I think the rest of the world is kind of catching up to that view. And we can have a debate about it right now. We're going to see what happens. But I think it's because it's grounded in human nature, and we are social creatures. You don't build relationships the same way. If I was there with you in person, we'd have probably gone to drinks last night. You'd know something about my family. I'd know something about yours. I'd know the reasons that you traveled to Europe or to Asia twice a month. And we would, we would be building a relationship, and it just doesn't happen like this.
Yeah, it was more I was traveling back to Seattle to work on my proposals than traveling to Asia. I could have stayed over there, but when I was in, I think what you're saying is exactly right. When I was in consulting, what I found was when I was in front of the potential client and was the last one in front of the potential client, the probability that I would get that engagement went up. Yeah. And if I hadn't seen that client for 2 months or a month, the probability was actually quite low.
Yeah, and talking to executives, I had some investment bankers here at the house yesterday. Some for lunch and then some for dinner. But them talking about, how investment banking is an apprenticeship, and not being with people and on the road with them is so debilitating to the cultures. In the short term, you can get it done. But in the long term, or even in the medium term, it's just an unworkable business model for them to not be in person with their teams and with their clients.
And for international business travel to Asia, you're looking at about 2 years to recovery?
Well, the real question in Asia is about, the biggest issue is zero tolerance policy. And so if you have an Australia, a New Zealand, a China that have zero tolerance policies for COVID, you're never going to be able to open to the world with zero tolerance. COVID is endemic. It is like the flu. It is going to be with us for the rest of our lives. At some point, I think they're going to get there and recognize that. And the cracks have started, both in Singapore and Australia, an acceptance that, we do need to get everyone vaccinated, but we're never going to get to a world where COVID is, we can't live in a world where COVID is zero. It's too late for that. But Asia is much further behind than the West on catching, because they've been able to close their borders, they have been able to get to zero cases or close to zero. And so that attitude is going to be the precursor of change, the necessary precursor of change. And so that's more of a political question than it is a scientific question, I think.
So here at the Anderson Forecast, we like to look back at history and at data and say, are there historical circumstances that might inform us? So I've been thinking about this and would love to have your thoughts on it. So if you think about business travel, kind of going way back in history, it used to be, first of all, across the Atlantic before the Boeing 707, it was by ship. And so when you went on a trip to Europe or from Europe to the US, you planned a very long trip, right? You were going to stay for a while because the cost of getting there was high, not just in money, but in time. And then with the advent of aviation, the trips became shorter and kind of more frequent. And thinking about now we have new technologies, platforms like this one that can be used. So when I was going to Asia, for example, you would put a lot of things together, some things that you wanted to get done, but were of kind of lesser importance because you were going to be gone for 2 weeks. What are your thoughts of those things that were kind of lesser importance you don't have to do necessarily in person, and trips getting shorter, but more of them happening? So you're going for a shorter period of time because you can do other things using new technology.
So I guess I hadn't thought of this until you just said it, but I'll go back even further in history. And in December of 2019, over the Christmas holidays, I'm an avid reader. I read about 3 hours a day, and I happened to read a book. I don't remember the name of it, but it was about the history of pandemics and how they have shaped human society, and it went back thousands of years. And the origin of the word quarantine, from the bubonic plague showing up, in the port of Venice, and where that came from, or I didn't even know it, but there was essentially a wall across Eastern Europe to quarantine people for 40 days when goods were traveling back and forth on the Silk Road, and what happened during the Spanish flu, and there've been multiple pandemics throughout history. And I say that because, to your point, in the entire arc of human history, our desire to be more connected to people and to travel more and experience each other and be around each other has continued to grow. It has grown out of every one of those pandemics in history. And as travel technology has gotten easier, it's expanded and grown. And that has been the course of human history. And technology has served to make that desire to connect more even stronger. I can remember having these debates 30 years ago when I was starting in aviation about video conferencing, which was first starting up, and it's going to kill business travel. It did no such thing. And it didn't for exactly the same reasons. Human nature hasn't changed. We need to be around other people. And that's been true for thousands of years. And as technology grows, we grow more ability to be around other people. And I would have said, you could have said, well, the internet, is going to make it easier to communicate. And why do you need to? It's now, before you could do video conferencing, even, it's easier to email, and none of those technologies have ever caused people to have less desire to connect with each other. If anything, they've caused it to be more to connect with each other. The more connected you get, the more connected you want to be. And look, we can debate it till the cows come home. I guess we're going to see. But I would actually argue, to your point, Jerry, that if you look back at the thousands of years of human history, it would support my view that business travel is going to come back 100%, because that's what humans have done for as long as we've known about it.
So there was an interesting comment about the more you're using technology and kind of connected over the internet, the more you want to connect in person. There was a study by 2 professors at Rutgers University of open spaces, and they were looking back at an earlier study that filmed open spaces and how people use them in order to better design urban spaces. And they want to kind of replicate that and see what's happening in today's world. And what they found was that millennials, who we view as the most connected generation that sit at the dinner table and text each other, that they were the ones who were personally connecting. And it was boomers who were on their phone in these public spaces. And so that's just, exactly to your point. So what about international leisure travel?
That already over the, we saw that more than 100% recovered just this past summer. That when destinations are open, there's a huge desire maybe that's just pent up demand. There is some pent up demand if you've been locked in, and people have, have saved a lot of money from not spending, and they had stimulus money and have gone. But I think it's even stronger. And look, on a very personal level, I can say, like, I travel a ton before for personal and for business, and worked for airlines my whole life, so could do it for free and did it. And but I like it even more now, and appreciate it even more now, because it feels richer. It feels more meaningful, and you more notice the things that you that you didn't notice before, about traveling, and being with people. And what we're doing at United, for example, when we are together, we, instead of having routine meetings where you go through a scorecard and sort of nothing happens with a big PowerPoint deck, like, at least for me, like, I've been trying to tell people either 0 or at most 1 slide, because you talk. And when you talk, you realize the great thing about talking is the conversation can go in tangents. And I said yesterday at an event, like, all the big ideas are tangents. You never have a big idea when you're having a meeting about X. The meeting is about X, and something comes up and somebody goes off in a different direction, and you do a tangent to X. That's where the big ideas happen, and occur serendipitously. And we were in Southern California, our executive team, earlier this week. And I don't know if we'll do it, but we had a conversation about one thing and it went in a different direction. And we have a really big idea that we're working on now. And that would have never happened on Zoom. It just can't happen in a format like this, but it happens in person.
So staying with international business travel, and you are the chair of the Star Alliance Chief Executive Board, which means, and so you're interacting with the CEOs of international airlines. Can you enlighten us as to kind of their perspective? Are you still the optimist of one, or?
They're getting closer to where I am. And there are some other CEOs that I think now agree with where we are. But it really depends somewhat on where you are. Like, I'm headed to Europe on Monday to see some of them. In Europe and the US, a lot more airline CEOs, whether they're in Star or others, are saying the same kind of thing that we're saying now, because we're seeing it. In Asia, there's still an awful lot of worry because they're not seeing it yet. The borders are still closed, and there's no way business travel is going to come back if you got to have a 14-day quarantine. Right. People aren't going to do that. So they're not seeing it yet, but we in Europe and the US have been seeing it already. And so I think there's a growing, I think actually if you hold privately US and European CEOs, they might not say 100%, but they'd all be close to 100% on their expectation of recovery now, because we're seeing it.
Yeah, and I was reading that business travel within the EU has picked up kind of dramatically.
Yeah.
So, the pandemic has affected a lot of the service industries. Restaurants have been reconfiguring, offices are reconfiguring in response to consumer demand or worker demand. Thus far, I think we haven't seen any real move to reconfigure aircraft in response to the pandemic. And as you say, it's endemic, so it's going to be kind of ongoing. Are you thinking about how one might change, particularly business class, to give not to give away secrets, but kind of more generally, how United Airlines, or maybe the airline industry in general, is thinking about configurations these days?
So first, I'd start with the changes that happened for airlines that are relevant for COVID really started back in the 70s. And this was a movement to stop the spread of airborne infectious diseases on airplanes. and particularly around tuberculosis. And because of that, airplanes were designed with airflow that makes it really hard to spread airborne infectious diseases. And what that means is that we have HEPA grade filters on board all of our aircraft. And the air is recirculated through HEPA grade filters every 2 to 3 minutes. The next highest level of airflow that you get anywhere around is in a hospital ICU, which also has HEPA grade air filters, but the refiltration rate is every 20 to 30 minutes. So it's literally 10 times more air filtration on board an airplane as you get in a hospital intensive care unit. That's why we at United partnered with the Department of Defense and did a study back in April, May of last year. We had to do it, I think, 3 times because when they looked at the data, they said we had to have made a mistake because the data basically says it's impossible to get, almost impossible to get COVID on board the airplane because of the air filtration. The conclusion of that study was being on board an airplane, if you're sitting in a middle seat with 2 people right next to you, it's the equivalent, that viral load that you're exposed to is the equivalent of being 15 feet away from them in a building. And I tell you all that because the airplane literally is the safe. If you're going to be indoors with people, an airplane is literally the safest place you can be. So the changes are less about configuration of the airplane, but more about stronger cleaning protocols. Probably not as relevant, particularly for COVID, since it is airborne. But we've put in all kinds of cleaning protocols and put antimicrobial coatings inside the airplanes that really make the airplane an even safer place to be. But all a very long way of saying, if you're going to be around other people, it may feel like it's a small can, and it is, but because of the way the airplanes have been designed, it's literally the safest place you can be and be indoors.
And does that extend to the terminals as well?
It doesn't, but that's changing also. So the terminals are now going to have HEPA grade 13 filters at airport. That had already started at airports. That had already been a rule at airports for air filtration, that they have much higher grade air filtration than you see at any other buildings. But that movement is now, it applied to new airports that were being built, and I don't know when it happened, but it was decades ago, but it's not everywhere. So other airports around the country are upgrading to that standard. But being in an airport, is like being, is in the airport terminal is similar to being in other locations where you're indoors, and you should follow the same policies. You should be vaccinated, and much more appropriate to wear masks when you're around other people. But you should follow in an airport, I think, the same policies you would follow in an office building.
I'd like to turn back to trans-Pacific travel again, because we're located here in Los Angeles, and we definitely have an Asian orientation.
Yeah.
In 2018, 1.8 million Chinese citizens came to California. So trans-Pacific is sort of a big part of California and of the West Coast, and you all have hubs in San Francisco and here in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And you're taking on all of these new aircraft. So does that portend an expansion of your hubs here in Los Angeles and SFO?
Well, a lot of those 1.8 million Chinese citizens came on United Airlines. We're the largest airline, flying to across the Pacific. And we had 13 flights a day into China before the pandemic. Today, the government only is allowing us to have 4 flights a week. So it's down significantly. We were and still are anticipating ultimate robust growth in Asia, including some new countries that we don't fly to today that we expect we will ultimately be flying to. But in the near to medium term, we just got to get the borders reopened and get back to where we were before. We were working on even things like trying to get slots in some of these airports around the world so that we're prepared in Asia, so that we're prepared to ultimately add service in places we don't currently fly. But in the near term, until the borders are open, there's not going to be expansion in Asia. We're not even allowed to expand in Asia if we wanted to. but look forward to that happening sooner than later, hopefully.
Yeah, so the growth in the California hubs is more medium term than near term.
Well, growth to Asia. There's growth domestically, and we just get, this week new service from San Francisco and Los Angeles to London Heathrow, for example. Our European services have done really well out of LA. We started service back into JFK out of LA and San Francisco during the pandemic. So there's growth in those. Oh, a lot of service from the West Coast to Latin America, which has done really well that we added. But it's just the Pacific that's going to take longer to recover. But otherwise, there's pretty significant growth happening for us in California.
Okay, so now turning away from the pandemic's impact on business travel, I wanted to explore a little bit to what extent are environmental regulations going to change the industry, and how do you see that evolving over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I don't really view it through the lens of regulation. I view it through the lens of doing the right thing. And this is a personal passion of mine. I said before, I read 3 hours a day. I'm I am a geek and a science geek, and I've been interested in climate change. It's been fascinating since I was in college. And it's the biggest issue that the globe needs to solve. And despite all the talk about it now, which is good, there are very few people that really understand the science and how catastrophic some of the implications of climate change can be, particularly because all the feedback loops in climate change, almost all of them, are positive feedback loops, meaning as it warms, it causes other things to happen which accelerate the warming. The rate of warming accelerates as it gets warmer. And those are really, really dangerous because that's how processes spiral out of control with those kinds of positive feedback loops. But at United, we are without question the leading global airline in dealing with climate change, but a leading corporation. And one of the important things that we view it differently is we view it as a science issue, not a marketing issue. And that's really important because what that means is we invest in sustainable aviation fuel. And right now, United Airlines commitment to sustainable aviation fuel is more than double all the rest of the world's airlines combined. I hope that record doesn't last long because everyone catches up with us. But we're putting our money where our mouth is there. We're the first airline to invest in electric aircraft. But the most important thing is we're focused on carbon sequestration. And I think this is the most important point for people to realize that care about climate change is, and this is to the science, not marketing point. Because there's so many companies that are using carbon offsets as their way to say that they are already net zero or getting to net zero. And carbon offsets particularly mostly means planting trees. And there's nothing wrong with planting trees, except it cannot scale to amount to more than a drop in the bucket for climate change. If we planted all the acreage on Earth that could grow trees, and could snap our fingers and magically have them be mature, it accounts for less than 5 months of mankind's emissions, and then we're done. Oh, by the way, we probably all starve to death too because there's no farms left on the planet. And the problem is when 99% of corporate America is relying on carbon offsets as their way to get to net zero, most of them are not even real. But even if they were real, it simply cannot solve the problem. We're focused on carbon sequestration at United and aggressive steps on electric aircraft and on sustainable fuels. But this isn't just an aviation issue. This is an all of corporate America issue. We've got to get off the marketing mantra of carbon offsets or we will not solve the problem.
Yeah, but in that regard, electric aircraft or biofuel powered aircraft are something new, and isn't that going to have an impact on your customers in the sense of, well, this is new, I'm not sure that this is tried, I'm reluctant to go ahead with this as opposed to something that I know, which is using jet fuel?
I don't think so. Sustainable aviation fuel, we did a big confirmation test. There was some press about it 2 weeks ago. flying an airplane. I'm going to be flying on an airplane that's 100% staff on, I think, December 1st with some of our partner EcoSky's Alliance partners, and we understand that it's basically the same. It's chemically the same as jet fuel, and there's that is a tried and true technology, not one that people should be concerned about. Electric aircraft are new, but electric aircraft are also a little more of a niche than sustainable aviation fuel, which in theory could hopefully scale up to be sizable. Electric aircraft, because of the energy density of batteries to weight is so low compared to jet fuel, we're never going to have big electric airplanes flying from LA to Asia, probably ever. I mean, there's no even theoretical physics that anyone has postulated that would allow for an energy density to fly big airplanes long distances. Short airplanes or helicopters, short distances, yes. But big airplanes flying long distances are unlikely.
Yeah, this is what we used to call it, Douglas, thrust chasing weight.
Yeah.
So you're optimistic about the future. You've got growth plans. And as we look forward, though, there are going to be a lot of pilot retirements, just as one aspect of the industry. And I wonder if you talk about those kinds of constraints and how they're going to impact the U.S. airline industry over the next decade.
Yeah, there already is a challenge on hiring pilots. We don't have a challenge at United Airlines, but the regional airlines that feed us have a challenge hiring pilots, and the reason is twofold. One, the military produces fewer pilots than they did back in the Vietnam era, or in the Cold War era. When I went to the Air Force Academy, they just produced fewer pilots, as they should. But secondly, there are huge barriers to entry to becoming a pilot. It's one of the few occupations that you can't go get a government loan to get your training, to go to college. You can get a government loan to go be a lawyer, to get an MBA, but not if you want to be a pilot. And you got to spend $150,000 in order to kind of get enough hours to get on the first rung of the ladder to get started and hire. And so that leads to a shortage of pilots, but it also leads to a world where United Airlines has more women or people of color as pilots than any other U.S. airline, to the best of my knowledge. But only 19% of our pilots are currently women or people of color because of those barriers to entry. So what we've done at United is we're the only U.S. airline that has this. We've purchased and are building our own flight training academy outside of Phoenix, Arizona, where we're going to train at least 500 pilots per year. And we've also committed that at least half of those pilots will be women or people of color. So we're going to train the next generation of pilots from the ground up, give people a chance, give people an opportunity, access a large pool of people. We'll also have a training program that I think is actually going to be better than today's, because it'll be focused on what we want pilots to be from a safety, from a regulatory, but from a customer service perspective as well. And so we'll have a better training regimen, but it'll access a much larger pool of talent for us. And at least at United, that's the approach that we're taking to address pilot shortage. And it'll be good for us to deal with the pilot issue, but it's a real action to make a difference on diversity efforts as well.
Now I'd like to turn to some of the questions that we have from our audience. And the first one's actually really interesting for us in California, who travel those 12 to 15 hours to Hong Kong, which is about your boom deal.
Yeah.
And maybe you could tell us about the boom deal and what you expect to happen there and the time frame.
Yeah. So boom is our supersonic aircraft that we were the launch customer for supersonic airplanes. We're excited about that. Airplanes, by the way, also the first aircraft engines, jet engines, to ever be designed from the ground up to run on 100% sustainable aviation fuel. That was one of the criteria for us. But we're excited about being able to cut the travel times significantly, give customers a great experience. It'll be the end of the decade before those planes are probably flying. But it'll be a great experience for customers. And United, United, I think, is already the leading global airline. I think by the time we're at this point next year on the other side of the pandemic, that'll be very few people that disagree with that. But with our hubs in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Newark, Dulles, we're in a unique position. We're in the biggest international business markets of any U.S. airline. And because of that, we were uniquely positioned to be the launch customer for supersonic aircraft, and I look forward to being on the first flight. First one will probably be across the Atlantic instead of across the Pacific, but being on the first flight across the Atlantic someday.
That sounds great. Can't wait to cut some of those hours off of the Trans-Pacific flights. But staying with Trans-Pacific, and something that's really important again for us in California, our seaports are, and not just California, all up and down the Pacific coast are chock full with ships trying to get in and delivering cargo. Early on in the pandemic, there were Trans-Pacific flights bringing in PPP, but now, as you said, there are a limited number of flights, and that affects belly cargo and the amount of cargo that can be brought in. Are you seeing other ways in which air cargo can be part of the solution here, or is it again having to wait until you get more flights and you have more belly cargo space?
So first, I experienced it firsthand earlier this week, being there in Southern California, and we were headed back to the airport. We drove by Long Beach. Well, one, you could see all the ships at anchor out, but drove by Long Beach. And my wife used to work for a freight forwarder, and so she went to Long Beach frequently. And she was just like taking pictures like, oh my God, I've never seen this. I've been here 50 times. I've never seen something like this. So seeing it firsthand. But at United, we actually have been carrying, again, another thing that we've been unique. We've more than doubled our cargo capacity during the pandemic revenues and the amount that we're carrying. And so while we are not flying passenger airplanes in some places, we converted many of those airplanes to cargo only, and we're unique in doing that. And so we've been flying a lot of that, and we see it happening right now. That the supply chain constraints, the port constraints, means that there's even more cargo it's cargo that used to go on ships that is now converting and flying on airplanes. It used to be only high value cargo, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, high value to weight ratio products, but we increasingly see a much broader array of material flying on the belly of our airplanes. But we're a little unique, and in doubling the amount of cargo that we're carrying during the pandemic.
And as you go forward in your plans, are you going to be converting more of your older aircraft to cargo airplanes?
No, in fact, as passenger demand recovers, we'll switch. We'll fly more in passenger service. We didn't actually take the seats off of any of the airplanes. We're just using the bellies. So the bellies will still be available, but the flying will orient more to passenger markets, because even in a good market, passenger cargo in normal times is less than 10% of the revenue on board a passenger airplane. So we'll be pointed in the passenger markets, but the bellies will be more full than they've been historically.
Okay, and let's see if we have any more questions from the audience. So there is a question in this, actually a couple of questions, I'll try and summarize them, but they have to do with marketing towards leisure or discretionary travel versus business travel, frequent flyer programs, and some of the things that the new startups are trying to do with niche travel and point-to-point in various locations of smaller airports. What is your view of that as we come out of this pandemic and we get growth, and especially strong growth in business travel, and that in some sense you've got some competition in terms of you're offering two different products, business and leisure. Yeah.
Well, we serve both the business and the leisure market, but at least at United, our hubs are in the, our 7 hubs are in, all in the top 10 in terms of total size of market. So we're a big market airline. But we serve small communities, but our service to small communities is get them into the hub where then they can connect to 100 destinations around the world. We're not going to be in the business of flying, point to point, flights from Burbank to Mesa, Arizona, which there's an airline out there that at least they did that for a few weeks, and then I think they stopped because it didn't work. We're an airline that is in the big cities. We serve small communities by getting them into the hubs and letting them connect to hundreds of destinations, and that's our business. That's our model. We're a more premium airline, a much better product. You're not going to get crammed into the seats like you are on some of those other airlines. You can rely on us for technology, things like that. So we're in a little different place. I like where we are compared to, our chief commercial officer, a guy named Andrew Nacella, jokes about some of these business models. You can fly from, he says, I don't mean this to be pejorative, you can fly from nowhere to somewhere as an airline and make it work. But when you're trying to fly from nowhere to nowhere, that's a bad business model. So 2 small cities, there's just not enough people flying between them. What has worked in that sector is big leisure destinations, basically Las Vegas, Orlando, maybe Southern Florida. That works. But when you're trying to fly between Burbank and Mesa, Arizona, that is a tough business model.
Yeah, it requires much smaller aircraft than United, the mainline United flies.
Yeah, and then it's higher cost. It still costs so much to land at an airport to take it for an airplane to take off. And when you shrink the number of seats, the size of the airplane, the cost per seat goes up. And so you have a business model that you're a low-cost airline. If you fly in small airplanes, then you're not a low-cost airline anymore all of a sudden.
And so turning back to constraints to growth, for our final question this hour, what about airports? So many airports, such as LAX here in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
LAX is investing $14 billion in infrastructure, but the airport is a busy airport, and JFK is a busy airport. O'Hare is a busy airport.
Yeah.
How does this impact the ability to grow with growing demand as we come out of this pandemic?
Yeah, it is absolutely. There are a number of airports around the country where we are constrained by airport constraints. Mostly it's airspace constraints. It's less about the facilities on the ground. In most cases, it's airspace constraints. But we take a long time in this country to address infrastructure. And United would be much larger in Los Angeles if Terminal 9 was built. Hopefully Terminal 9 is going to get built, and I think it'll be a United terminal, and eventually we'll grow. But until that happens, we run almost 9 operations per gate, which is as much as anyone in the country does anywhere in Los Angeles, at least pre-pandemic. And so we're stuck. We can't grow. We can add bigger airplanes. That's how we're growing in Los Angeles. Same thing in San Francisco. Airport is full. And anytime there's weather, which is pretty often in San Francisco, you wind up canceling flights because there's more flights scheduled than the airport can handle. And the only way to grow is bigger airplanes. Same thing is happening in Newark. So what we're doing is in these constrained airports that's part of our aircraft order. Buying 500 bigger airplanes, replacing up to 300 smaller airplanes means we can add more seats for customers, even though we don't have more operations per hour. But hopefully the infrastructure bill will get passed. Aviation is one of those that will benefit from infrastructure. We're not, obviously not the only industry or part of the country, but there are real infrastructure constraints in this country. We don't invest nearly as much. The red tape, the regulatory process for getting projects approved is so much more difficult here than elsewhere in the world. And it's a disadvantage for us when we're competing with economies around the globe that can move faster on building infrastructure, which is, those are the arteries that support great jobs in infrastructure and research and development. And if you don't have the arteries, the limbs will die. And so we need to do infrastructure. I'll leave it at that. We need to get an infrastructure bill done. We're very supportive of it. Hopefully something is going to get through in DC, but hopefully something is going to get done on that, which will help across the board.
Well, so to end on a high note, it's my understanding that Terminal 9 at LAX passed one of the green light milestones this last week.
Okay, that's good to hear.
That's good news.
It's way behind schedule, but it's good to hear.
I'm not sure it's fully green lighted, but
it's not fully green lighted yet. I think I would have heard if it was fully green lighted. I'm looking forward to it though.
But it's moved forward at least a little bit.
Yeah, that's good.
Scott, thank you so much for joining us here at UCLA today and sharing your insights on what's going to happen, not only in business travel, but in the commercial aviation business in general. We really appreciate you taking the time this morning. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jerry. Enjoyed talking to you, and to all the students. If you want to come to work at United Airlines, it's going to be a place you're proud of.